let's get started. I'm Steve Bellovin, who's supposed to be talking now about developing trust and assurance. And being the moderator is good because I don't really have to say very much. I depend on the folks off to my left to say what needs to be said. And I'm going to ask them each to start with a few minutes of opening thoughts. We'll have discussions and ultimately questions from the audience. So, Laura, why don't you start? So, start with Laura DeNardis, professor at American University. You've all got her bio in front of you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. When I was asked to be on this panel, was reminded of a 1999 book that came out called Trust in Cyberspace. It was a multi-year study. It was published by the National Academies of Science. And it was very clear at that point that trust would be a precursor to even the possibility of a universal and growing internet. Trust between network operators, trust in the authentication of emails, in people and information online, and all aspects of trust, both technical infrastructure and social. So what has changed in the intervening years is that the economy and the public sphere now are completely dependent upon digital infrastructure, and therefore trust is a much more important issue even than it was then. At the same time, there is a loss of trust in this infrastructure that's borne out by polling, by various kinds of quantitative and qualitative research, and that is due to a variety of different factors, including concern about government surveillance, concern about private data surveillance, the increasing politicization of infrastructure, and of course the very high-profile security breaches ranging from the massive security breach of Yahoo emails to things close to where we live in Washington, the Office of Personnel Management getting hacked. So this is all happening, and a recent poll that was conducted by the Center for International Governance Innovation, CG Ipsos survey on internet security and trust that just came out, it polled 24,000 users in 24 countries. And it found that a majority of respondents were more concerned about privacy than they had been in the previous year. This is partly due to some of the concerns that I mentioned before, but it's increasingly due to concern about users' own governments and what they're doing online. And in fact, this poll indicated that only half of respondents trust their governments to act responsibly online. So society is at a tipping point in which improvements in digital trust are more than ever before necessary to sustain the global digital economy and the public sphere. And as we've heard today, it's not surprising that some of the most contentious issues really are around issues of trust. They're tussles, to use the term computer scientist Dave Clark uses. Tussles over trust, stability of infrastructure, trust in voting systems, trust in news, trust in the privacy of user data, and of course, all aspects of cybersecurity. So what on earth does this have to do with fragmentation or universality? Well, it has everything to do with it. The extent of trust will, as it always has, determine whether the internet continues to expand into a universal network or fragment into segments, as people have described earlier today. So I thought what I could add is since I'm an engineer by training and I study the politics of that infrastructure, I thought I would add just 3 trends around infrastructure that relate directly to fragmentation. One, of course, is about how the internet is diffusing into the material world and what this means for human rights, freedom, and global tech policy. This is the subject of the book that I'm researching and writing right now, and it looks at how cyberspace now, because it permeates offline spaces as much as online spaces, it creates new public policy problems that portend different kinds of fragmentation. So an internet outage, is very relevant to cybersecurity and fragmentation. An internet outage is no longer about losing communication. It's about losing the ability to drive a car or access medical care. So this shift from the from the virtual realm to the material realm raises the stakes significantly over trust. The second backdrop, infrastructure-wise, of this intersection of fragmentation and trust is that technical infrastructure and the arrangements of technical infrastructure are increasingly a proxy for state power. We see this with the domain name system being locally redirected and used by China for censorship, by other countries for intellectual property rights enforcement. We see this with the turn to DDoS attacks and infrastructure attacks to disrupt activists and alternative media. We see data localization laws, as Anupam and others described in the earlier panel. That's absolutely an example of tampering with infrastructure and arrangements of architecture for political means. These are not local problems. They're international relations challenges because of the ability to reach across borders to disrupt physical systems as well as virtual systems. Now, of course, the technical infrastructure of the internet doesn't at all map with geopolitical borders, so it raises a host of fragmentation-related questions. And then the third infrastructure suggestion is that when you think about infrastructure fragmentation, and I can't believe I'm saying this because of some of the writings that I've had, like one internet, but in this area, it's not always desirable to have a universal internet. Right? In specific areas, we have to think that just like all other aspects of the internet, the value of fragmentation is also context dependent. So when we think about the internet as a digital economy and as a communication network, there are many metrics, easy to calculate. Lots of work has been done by the OECD and others about the value of universality. When you think about the internet as a control network for physical systems, that's a different story. So in highly trust-dependent areas, we have to acknowledge that there are conditions in which fragmentation is actually desirable. And I'll just close with the thought that what ties all of these together in terms of solutions? Well, it's cybersecurity. As the internet shifts from a content-centric communication network to a network that is designed to control all physical artifacts in the material life, including pacemakers, including cars, including cyber-physical systems, industrial control systems. Because an outage means an outage in the real world and not just sending a text message or accessing Wikipedia, this really does change the stakes. So technical architecture does not map neatly onto these geopolitical borders, and for that precise reason, a lot of the solutions are technical solutions that mirror these kinds of problems. Human security now depends on infrastructure stability. Privacy, now more than ever, depends on cybersecurity. And we know that democracy also depends on a secure infrastructure. So at this intersection of trust and fragmentation, I would say it's not an exaggeration to say that cybersecurity is the great human rights issue of our time. Thank you very much.
I have here from Angela, Director of Cybersecurity Policy at Microsoft.
Perfect, thanks. And I'd like to start first by thanking Columbia and the school for having us here. I think that the conversation on trust and assurance is one that is incredibly important at this time. Much like my colleague Laura, I'm in the public policy domain, but my background is engineering. So I'm going to first start by challenging one of the questions that we were supposed to actually be speaking to. But I thought it would provide a really nice framing. One of the questions for the overall panel is, will security concerns drive national regulations, or can we build trust-enhancing regulatory frameworks in a cross-jurisdictional way? I thought that was a really interesting question, and I wanted to challenge it for a couple of reasons. First of all, the framing of will security concerns is a future tense framing. And I think the first thing that we need to recognize is it's not something that is going to be happening in the future. It's something that is happening right now. You actually have regulation, both national regulation and cross-jurisdictional regulation, that is occurring in different places in the world that is starting to challenge, that is both enhancing trust but starting to challenge how businesses operate. Whether you're talking about Europe, who's very active in this space, the Network and Information Security Directive, GDPR, whether you're talking about what's coming out of China with their cybersecurity regulation, This is already happening. This is the environment in which we are already at. It is also occurring domestically. You see this particularly in the regulated industries with use of existing regulation being applied or expanded to address cybersecurity. The other thing that I thought that was interesting about this question is it focused on how government action is going to be driving trust-enhancing behavior. And ultimately, at least right now, there isn't a ton that is driving that. It's not just government policy, despite what we see coming out of Europe, for example. It's also companies self-initiating the kind of behaviors, whether it's policies, operating models, architectural models, or practices in terms of improving trust. And why is this? Again, this is very similar to something that Laura said. Ultimately, for us, we need to have our customers' trust, our partners' trust, and government's trust in order to be able to realize the potential of the technology and the data. And that potential could be a wide variety of things, whether it's cost savings, increased productivity. We fundamentally need to have trust. One of the other questions here talked about what what policies, just policies, companies could take to help increase trust. And I think that's really important. Companies do a lot in their corporate policy to improve trust, whether it's things like requiring practices for improving software assurance, reducing the number and severity of vulnerabilities, whether it's requirements about how we manage operational security. But it's not just our corporate policies that are changing, as I highlighted earlier. It's also things where we're making customer commitments that are not being driven by commitments to our customers that are not being driven by a governmental policy. Imagine and think about what Google, Facebook, and Microsoft all did in a post-Snowden context. It wasn't a governmental concern. We had concerns from our customers, and so we went out and said, we're going to make a commitment to encrypt all data in motion and all data at rest, and we're going to do it on a particular timeline. That is not responsive to a governmental requirement. That is responsive to customer concerns. One of the other ones that I want to highlight that I think most people don't tend to realize is that companies are also evolving their actual operating models, their business service offerings to be able to deal with concerns about trust. One of the ones that I talk about sometimes is the data custodian model that we have built in our cloud infrastructure to handle concerns about access to data from European customers. Anybody familiar with that? No? No? Okay. One person. But basically, this is a construct where Microsoft is operating the data center and it is running Azure code, but we have partnered with Deutsche Telekom as the data custodian. So this is not just changing what our policy is. This is not just changing what our practices are. This is not just changing how we're architecting and where we're building data centers. It's actually creating new joint ventures and new partnerships to help address valid concerns about access to data. And then the one other thing I wanted to highlight is we're also not just changing in response to valid concerns. Trust is not solely a technical concern. There are things that we can do in this environment, but trust is a belief. It is a confidence in terms of how people are operating. And you can provide information and you can do things in your policies, your operating models, your architecture, and your commitments to increase trust, but it's a belief. And once you lose trust, it is something that is almost impossible to regain. So the last thing in terms of challenging the question, and then I'll pivot very quickly to things that can be done, is it highlighted that, is it national regulation or cross-jurisdictional action? And ultimately, we think it's not going to be one or the other, but a little bit of both. And one of the things that I try and do in my job as leading our global public policy work on this space is try and think about where is it appropriate and helpful to be in a cross-jurisdictional construct. And of course, as a global company, we love cross-jurisdictional solutions to problems. But at the same time, it is important to recognize that there are parts of the trust and assurance challenge that are specific to national security type concerns. And that oftentimes is not going to be managed in a cross-jurisdictional context. You know, there's part of my team's priorities. We have to outline our team priorities every year. We're coming up on our new fiscal year, so I'm doing that activity with my team right now. But there's one line in our priorities where it says foster harmonization. Foster harmonization of cybersecurity and cloud security public policy on a global basis. What I think is actually important, though, is more realistically, and the way that we talk about it oftentimes internally, is about managing fragmentation. Because as I said, fragmentation is already occurring. And it's one of the things that we're trying to manage over time. So relevant to this particular challenge set, I think that there are a couple of things that can be very helpful in thinking about how to manage fragmentation such that it does not fundamentally diminish realizing the value of technology and data. The first part is making sure that you understand which part of the cybersecurity challenge are you working on. Are you working on the general good things that almost every kind of organization needs to do, whether it's government or industry, the boring word called hygiene that everybody has talked about? Are you dealing with a series of concerns that truly are relevant to national security? How the command and control functionality for nuclear capabilities are managed and the technology that supports that. Which part of that problem are we working on? The second thing is actually which part of the technology problem set in cybersecurity are you thinking about? Are you looking at software assurance, how code is developed and then patched to help improve and manage security over time? Are you looking at how supply chain security is managed? And that is one that has a lot of geopolitical context and national security in it. Or are you looking at operational assurance, how technology is configured, installed, and maintained over time? The other thing is we also have to think about which part of the problem set we're looking at in terms of stakeholders. It used to be that we just started to talk about what the large-scale technology providers were doing for technology. But almost every single organization is a technology company at this time. Whether you're talking about the world of IoT that comes up quite often, or you're talking about large retailers, almost every single company is building and operating code in one way, shape, form, or another. But the kind of levers that apply from public policy to drive behavior are going to need to be different. And that gets to the last piece, which is what are the levers? You know, I engage in a lot of conversations on how to improve assurance and trust. And one of the things that I find very disappointing about those is sometimes they're very, very blunt conversations. They're not very nuanced. You have a whole set of people who would come from innovators who would say, you know, government needs to just stay out of this business. They have no role here. We are innovating. We are driving things forward. And you know what? There's some validity to that. They have concerns about how intervention from government may hinder economic growth and innovation. At the same time, I oftentimes also work with some other individuals who are like, you know what? We are tired of these vulnerabilities existing in technology. Platform providers need to take some kind of responsibility and be doing things to improve security. We need liability and regulation in this space. And you know what? They have valid concerns too. What I would encourage us to be thinking about in the conversation on trust and assurance is looking at the full range of levers that exist. Economic levers like standards, insurance, procurement are really, really helpful for more of the general hygiene part of the problem set. At the same time, there are higher order concerns that get with national security, and that's where concerns like liability and regulation may be actually appropriate. We need to think about which lever works for which part of the problem set, because any approach that is overly emphasized to one or the other will in fact bear out the fears and concerns of those communities. So looking at the full range of levers, and then the last piece, and I won't get to this because I don't think I have more time, is how companies can demonstrate adherence to those levers. How do companies actually show what they are doing for trust and security? There are ways to do that voluntarily, and there are ways to do that in response to requirements.
We'll just go in order of the chart. Andrea Glorioso, the Council for Digital Economy and Cyber, the EU delegation to the US.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. Is this working? Is it? Yeah, it is.
It is now.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Columbia for inviting me. I must say, as an Italian, it's a particular pleasure to be here at the Italian Academy, in this room full of Latin sentences of my Roman ancestors. Don't ask me what they mean, because it's been a long time since I studied Latin. I would like to approach, to throw a stone in the water, as we would say in Italian, the topics that we are addressing in this panel, not because I disagree with what my two colleagues have just said before me. In fact, I broadly agree, but I would suggest that it would perhaps be useful to take a step back, and when we think about trust, as it relates specifically to the issue of fragmentation, cross-border fragmentation of the internet, we should indeed take a step back and think about trust among human beings, what it means to have trust, what it means for our societies to have trust. And I think that as a European, and I assume most here in the public as Americans, we have a lot of assumptions, luckily for us, we have a lot of assumptions on how our societies work. We wake up in the morning and by and large, on average, there are unfortunate episodes of course, but on average we don't need to worry that a band of invaders will come to our door and shoot us. We don't think about it. We go to the supermarket and we buy food, and by and large we don't worry whether that piece of plastic that we're using is actually going to be accepted by the machine, what's happening behind that very simple act of swiping a piece of plastic. We buy food, we by and large don't worry what's in that food. I mean, we should, some should worry about what's in the food, but by and large we do not worry that we're going to die, depending on what we choose from a supermarket or from a grocery shop. And I could go on and on and on, but my point is that as Western, quote unquote, it's not a very sensible term, but just to understand each other, or let's say as modern societies, we have come to develop an extremely complex system of systems to manage our relationships with people and organizations that we never see. I mean, I don't honestly know who's involved in each and every piece, in each and every step of the transaction that happens when I swipe my credit card in a supermarket and I buy food. There are tens, hundreds of entities involved with that. I know almost none of those entities, but I just trust that the system works. And that is what allows, by and large, of all us to focus on our lives, so whatever it is that we want to do with our lives, whether you're a bureaucrat like me, or whether you are in the private sector, or whether you're an artist, we focus on that. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because after, I must say, many years working in the cybersecurity, privacy, digital economy, online environment field, I have the impression that as a community, or if you allow me as a bubble, and I put myself into that bubble, but as a policy bubble, dealing with this kind of stuff, we have not fully realized that 99.9999% of the population doesn't care at all about these discussions, doesn't really care. The vast majority of the population, certainly in Europe, and I believe also in the US, just wants stuff to work, doesn't want to worry why it's working, how exactly it's working, as long as it achieves the effects that it achieves. Again, if you talk about the digital economy more specifically, when people make a phone call or when they surf the internet, they really don't care what's happening behind the curtain. They just want it to work. What this means, though, is that when things break down, people are surprised. Because, again, there is a rather ingrained assumption because of the kind of societies in which, very luckily, we all live. And, by the way, this is not true all across the world. There are several countries in this world where this kind of assumptions just don't work, don't function. You can wake up in the morning and be killed. You can wake up in the morning and go to take some food and not be entirely sure whether you're going to die or not because of what you're eating. There are countries such as this today in the world, not our countries. So when things don't work, when your private data is compromised, when you find a false credit card statement, when your forthcoming autonomous car crashes somewhere, people are starting to ask questions. Why is that? What has happened? Because again, they assume, and I think we underestimate the power of this assumption. We underestimate the extent of this assumption. People just assume that things will work because that's what they see around them, by and large. Then they will ask questions. And what I personally believe, on the basis of my personal and professional experience, or my experience as an Italian and European citizen, what I have seen, is that what is really important when that question is asked, why this thing that I assume would work and that I really don't care how it works, but it has not worked right here and right now, people need to have somebody to ask that question to. Need to have institutions, organizations, that they can be public or private. And by and large, I must say, in Europe, I still think that, I don't have hard numbers, but my impression as a European is that people, by and large, will ask those sort of questions to public organizations, to their government, whether it's the local government or the national government or even the European Union. When something doesn't work in Europe, it's always Brussels' fault, which is kind of annoying. But on the other hand, I kind of take it as a compliment, because people actually believe that Brussels, the European Commission, the European Union has such incredible powers that we are responsible for things that work and also for things that don't work. But jokes aside, the point here is that where I would really focus, and there is a link to the fragmentation issue, where we should really focus is to make sure that we have in place the processes through which people know who they have to ask the question, why has this thing not worked, that we have in place the proper accountability procedures. Again, independently of whether the responsible organization or organizations are private or public, we need to have in place those accountability mechanisms. I do believe that in certain cases we also have to, those accountability mechanisms also have to include, as appropriate, regulation or anyway the ability to enforce the rules that collectively the citizenship, however you want to define the citizenship, has decided, including in this field. And why is all of this important? Because in a moment in which if I look at the past 20 years of political history, that is, let's say, the time period in which I was really interested in politics, so I was kind of paying attention to what was happening around me in Europe, it's quite clear to me that the level of trust, the average level of trust into institutions in general, public and private, has gone down quite a bit. And I think, and I say this, no moral judgment, no value judgment, I read, this is a statement of fact, I read somewhere that the latest polls in the US, according to the latest polls in the US, the only thing that US citizens like less than Congress is sexually transmitted diseases. In terms of, this is a poll that was conducted recently. This is very, very worrying. To me, it's extremely worrying when a citizenship has so little trust into institutions that are supposed to provide in some way or form. Now, it's Congress, it might be the European Parliament, it might be the European Commission, it might be anybody else. The problem is that when people feel that somehow things are not working the way that they assume they will be working, by the way, that assumption, those assumptions perhaps might not be the same assumption that we have on the food chain. It is possible that they are not completely transferable to the digital environment. It is possible that the digital environment is so complex that you simply cannot assume that things will just work in the same way that you assume on the food chain. Full disclosure, I do not believe that is the case. I know something about the food chain environment. It is an extremely complex value chain, but that's certainly something worth exploring. But the real problem is that when people are surprised because their assumptions and their trust, their assumed trust that things work in the digital environment when it comes to security, when it comes to privacy, when it comes to safety, you name it, they ask for a question, and if they don't have trust in the institutions that they expect would give them question, then they take bad decisions. And the problem with fragmentation is that people will always naturally, as people develop less trust, they naturally tend, is something we are seeing in Europe very much, I'm a diplomat, so I don't have political opinions on the US unless Brussels tells me that I have to have a political opinions, but I think we are seeing also in the US that people tend to go back to the people who give them easy answers, or tend to go back to organizations that are close to them. Naturally, this leads to fragmentation. If you look at the European Union, for example, the problem that we have, quite bluntly, is that on this as in other fields, people perceive that the union level, the European level, is not providing them with the kind of answers in this as in other fields that they want. It's not providing them the level of trust. They go nationally. Going nationally means more fragmentation, because it means that everybody will want their own peculiar rules on how things are done. So to conclude, I think that, as I said, I don't disagree at all with everything that has been said before. I think it's important to identify the right levers. I do know that public organization, I work for one, I've been working for one for 10 years. We do sometimes have a tendency to think about regulation as the immediate answer. It just comes easy to us. It doesn't mean that it's always the right answer. It doesn't either mean that it's always the wrong answer, so you need to look at the specific situation. So I don't disagree with anything that has been said, but I would argue that we really need to make an effort to take a step back and understand that all of these discussions, as interesting they are, and they are very interesting, they are by and large irrelevant for the vast majority of the population. So we need to wonder, where do we have to focus our attention? What happens when our citizens, when the trust that our citizens, when the assumed trust, the assumptions of trust of our citizens to this technology breaks, what do we do? Do we have a plan B? Because if we don't have a plan B, if we're not ready to provide that level of institutional trust in answer to things breaking down, then I am afraid that we're going to see even more fragmentation, not less fragmentation, which, by the way, and I should say this from the beginning, the party line from Brussels, which I happen to agree with, is that fragmentation is, by and large, not a very good thing for the internet. We do believe that it's better to have an open internet, although we also believe that there are instances, whether it's about privacy, whether it's about security, whether it's about other issues, where it's absolutely legitimate for any public organization, for any democratic public organization, to put limits, to put certain kind of limits. And with this, I think I will shut up and let my colleague continue.
Last speaker is going to be Joshua Corman, the Director for Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council.
Thank you. Is my mic on yet? I'll keep talking until you can hear me. Yes? Okay. All right, so some audience participation. I've changed my mind 3 times during these excellent remarks. I'm going to build upon it. Please, everyone look at the ceiling. All right, so modern societies depend upon steel and concrete, right? Not one of you sat in perpetual fear this morning that this building was going to crush us. We can take it for granted. It's transparent and invisible because it is dependable. I assert to you that our dependence on software is becoming as ubiquitous as steel and concrete, but it is not nearly as dependable. In fact, it's nearly infinitely vulnerable. Now, some uncomfortable truths that I want to build upon with our friends here. 100 of the Fortune 100 have lost intellectual property and trade secrets over the last 3 years. Nearly every single person in this room has had a credit card compromised. We spend about $80 billion a year on products alone to secure highly replaceable credit cards and the confidentiality of information. And our failure rate is 100%. The reason this has been acceptable is because the losses have been tolerable. These are absorbable losses. I would argue, controversially, that we have yet to have a high consequence failure in cybersecurity. Now let me define what I mean by consequential. Thus far, despite all those failures I've mentioned, including OPM, which almost certainly cost lives, including Ashley Madison, which absolutely took some suicides and broke up families, we haven't had a consequential failure yet because nothing has triggered the political will to have a corrective action that would be meaningful and substantive. One of the elephants in the room, and I'm not advocating yet for this extreme option, but one of the only things in this entire planet you're not liable for is software. We lack software liability, and therefore we lack accountability on those in the best position to avoid risk and harm. So some of these uncomfortable truths about rampant failure in low consequence areas have not yet triggered that political will to spawn meaningful and corrective actions. Now let's make this more about the research focus we've inherited from Jay Healy, the Cyber Statecraft Initiative. We tried to extend it in 2 ways. One is where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. So we're referring to this as cyber safety. So I would say that a high consequence failure in cyberspace is one that is measured in a loss of life, but more importantly, a crisis of confidence in the public to trust large parts of our GDP. Healthcare is between 1/5 to 1/6 of our economy. That may trigger a response that compromises our core values and the response that may be measured in blood and treasure. So if we don't think that we're going to encounter one of those in the not too distant future, that software that has failed us nearly 100%, we're now putting it into our cars, into our medical devices, into our hospitals, into our high-speed rail. And that software, which we do not yet know how to secure, is rife with issues. So we're very prone, and we are prey, but we have lacked, to date, we have lacked predators. So one area of focus that we've shifted into is cyber safety issues, which are local national security issues, but also international security issues. Number two is we're trying to expand beyond the aperture of nation-state norms, treaties, sanctions, deterrence models. Because in this new world, in this Westphalia Plus world with post-nationalisms, NGOs, and ideological actors, I'm much more concerned about an extremist using cyberspace who lays outside the reach of deterrence models. Most specifically punctuated with Junaid Hussain, or Trick, a former Team Poison anonymous hacktivist, went to jail for hacking Tony Blair's website, and at some point radicalized, left the comfort of his Birmingham, UK home, and helped drive and found the cyber caliphate as the number 3 most dangerous man in ISIS. So you had a hacktivist with very little skill, but with the means, motive, and opportunity to take human life. And while he was killed with the drone strike, while we have killed 2 more of his colleagues in the last 2 months, the very real presence of a non-state sub-state actor and how powerful they can be in cyberspace is a very troubling development. So one of the things I want to punctuate, because it's very timely, is one of the roles I've done is I've served on the Congressional Task Force for Healthcare and Cybersecurity. Our report's due in about 2 weeks. I'm going to highlight 5 uncomfortable truths we found about U.S. hospitals, and this is not isolated to the U.S. at all. Number 1, we estimate 85% or more of our health delivery organizations lack a single qualified security professional, not even one. There's no one protecting our hospitals. Number 2, they tend to be plagued with legacy equipment, very old, unsupported, well past end of life and support, like Windows XP or older, is a best case scenario. Number 3, they're hyper-connected and over-connected in part due to a US policy that went sideways, but they basically tend to have flat, wide open, unsegmented, we're going to get to fragmentation through this, wide, flat, unprotected networks that are exposed to the naked internet. Number 4, a single flaw in a single device was able to take out Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital patient care for over a week. One flaw in one device stopped patient care, and the same thing has happened in the UK. The National Health Services shut down several hospitals in November, and another bout of them this past January. And if you think that's an anomaly, number 5 is the real kicker. The average clinical medical device we encountered had over 1,000 known vulnerabilities in them. So when you have no one doing the security for these soft targets, they're securing indefensible things like Windows XP and older that are embedded, and you're not even allowed to patch them for several reasons. They're hyper-connected and overexposed to the internet. A flaw in any single one of them can impact patient care, and the average device has over 1,000. People should be quite concerned. So one of the things I testified to the Presidential Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity is that through our overdependence on undependable technology, we have created the conditions such that the actions of any single extreme outlier can have a profound impact on public safety and human life. The issue isn't even the deaths, it's the crisis of confidence, right? The corollary to trust. Imagine how these doctors will respond and react after the first catastrophic failure. They will distrust modern technology, hyper-connected technology. I mean, I wrote a chapter for Trey Hare's great book on cyber insecurity on policy recommendations for connected vehicle security. And we had a 2-year argument with the administrator of the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. He was so resolute that because of 100 US citizens dying per day in vehicular accidents, that we must get to autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicles immediately, and any discussion about hacking cars is a distraction to saving 100 people per day. And he was 100% right. And what finally broke the logjam was we pointed out that a single exotic death that triggers a crisis of confidence in the public to trust those connected vehicles will postpone his dream by 5 years. So that's really a promise and a peril thing, and I think we are a bit upside down in our mortgage, where we are depending on things and trusting things that are not dependable nor trustworthy. And I think the answer is going to be, if you want to see something different, we're going to have to try something different, and we're at the point where these uncomfortable truths command uncomfortable responses. The harder part is, while we were hoping that methods like nutrition labels and transparency and voluntary labeling could inform better free market choice, The late-breaking story last year with the Mirai botnet showed the long tail of low-cost, low-hygiene devices can cause externalities, and even if every single person in this room buys the right, most secure products with free market choice, the choices of others in the US or in the international community in a shared, unsegmented, single network, single internet, represent material risks to our commerce, to large chunks of the internet, to our economic issues, but also to safety. So that botnet was essentially fixed credentials, unpatchable, and naked to the internet. I just described every single clinical medical device. Fixed credentials, unpatchable, and naked to the internet. So don't look at what Mirai did one afternoon to parts of Netflix and Flickr and CNN. Look at what it could do were it targeted at hospital systems. Look at what could happen, not even with malfeasance from an actor like Trick from the Cyber Caliphate, but just through accidents and adversaries. That Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital shutdown was not deliberate. It was an accidental infection. Hackers had never previously tried to extort money from a hospital, but that accident showed how lucrative it could be. And last year we crossed the $1 billion mark on ransomware paid out of hospitals because they realized how lucrative it could be. So to pull this all back together, I don't think we should look at fragmentation necessarily as a pejorative. There's a healthy principle in Cybersecurity 101 of network segmentation and isolation. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think we should look at this like we look at complexity. You don't want something so simple. I mean, simple is a pejorative in some cases, but you don't want elective complexity. What we want is complexity that's valuable. We want commensurate complexity. And similarly, as we depend more on connected technology in areas affecting public safety and human life, we should look at what's valuable segmentation, valuable insulation. How do you limit the blast radius of some of these events? And I think we have almost undermined the debate by using such negative language for the last several years. So whether it's balkanization or fragmentation, maybe it's what is the valuable, sufficient level of segmentation and isolation for benefit. So I'm going to stop there. I said quite a bit, but I hope that we look at this as more high consequence. And the real big issue is even if we can get the political will in our own respective nations, this will take a multinational response for some minimum level of hygiene. One more silver lining, I guess. If you look at, Jay's been advocating for years that we need to invest more in defense. We're all about offense, right? The state of nature and the state of cyber is a state of offense. But many people scoff at that because even if you double our defensive capability, you're still not going to be tall enough to withstand a nation state. True. But if you don't just look at the capability, but you also look at the intent, I'm much more worried about the high intent, low capability adversaries like Trick. And raising the defense sufficiently high enough to exhaust the attack capacity of these lesser actors with more motivation could prove to be the very thing that preserves the trust that we already have in these institutions. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks all. Theme, of course, is fragmentation, and heard several speakers speak highly of it. I wonder if it's really achievable. Too many of the technologies we rely on connectivity to the cloud. The wonderful advances in speech recognition, image recognition, and so on are utterly dependent on the back-end cloud machines that we don't see. Can we actually achieve fragmentation? 20 years ago, I formulated what I jocularly called Bellovin's laws of networking, one of which, networks always interconnect. And can we actually achieve the necessary fragmentation?
Can I?
Yeah, please do.
I did indeed read your laws, Steve. I used to study computer security, and you were one of the topics on my books.
The topic or an author?
Yeah, it was a great reading. Look, and I would say that right now I'm expressing an informed but personal opinion on necessarily the position of the European Union. I always have to say that, given my role. I tend to agree, slightly disagree with my colleague. Not that I disagree, okay, let me rephrase. I think it's unavoidable. Just like you wrote that networks tend to network with each other, I think that the economic pressure towards global interconnectivity and cheap interconnectivity is just too high. And the only way that we could prevent that, even assuming that we would agree, and frankly there is not universal agreement on that, not even within Europe, there is agreement that it's really worth to segment our European network or national networks, there is no agreement on that, but even assuming that we wanted to do that, we could do that only via very, very hard regulation, with very high fines in case of non-compliance, because the economic incentive, not only by the private sector, by the way, but the public sector as well. The public sector is a big user, in Europe as in the US, is a big user of all these interconnected technologies. So as much as I can intellectually completely understand your argument, and I think it's a correct argument, I just don't think that it's feasible except in some very circumscribed and limited scenarios when it comes, for example, to national security, or very, very, it's really corner case scenarios in the big scheme of things. What I think that we should do is to basically assume that that interconnection exists. Also, we should not be naive. When we talk about the global internet, it does not mean that, to give an example, data centers cannot be located where we want them to be located. Many US companies, it's always been fascinating to me in the whole debate about data flows. Yeah, data flows, we can have the debate, but the harsh reality is that most major US companies already have data centers in Europe. And not because we oblige them to have data centers in Europe, but because their customers wanted data centers in Europe. And so even we do not necessarily need to think about the scenario in which every single piece of data travels from Europe to Singapore, back to the US and back to Europe. We can somehow circumscribe that if it makes business and security and technological sense, but we cannot really restrict that. And therefore, my argument would be we need to make sure that we create the condition in which if something goes wrong, hopefully not something as catastrophic as I agree we haven't yet experienced, then people at the very least have a clear understanding of who should they ask for relief or for questions, who should they direct their questions, what happened to, who should they ask for relief, what are the solutions, what are the compensations, maybe it's not the right English term, but I hope you can understand me, the compensation for what happened. That level of institutional / governance discussion is not happening as far as I can see. It might be happening in this room, it might be happening among experts. It's just not happening across the decision makers, the senior decision makers, and there is no real understanding among the mythical man or woman of the street of that. If your bank account, if you see money missing from your bank account, you know who to call. Okay, it's written on the back of your credit card. It's pretty simple, actually. Or if your credit card is hacked, etc. If your computer is penetrated by botnet, who do you call? Not the Ghostbusters, that's clear. Who do you call? There is no widespread understanding in our societies about that. And if we don't have that, I'm afraid, because I do believe that we will have even more troubles than we have until now, that will again lower trust.
I think it's very important that we don't have a takeaway from this panel that we're seeking fragmentation, achieving fragmentation. I want to just say, at least on behalf of myself, that there are very real threats from fragmentation, both to the digital economy, to access to knowledge, and to free speech. And that there are very real trends that are working against that universality. One of them is the resurgence of proprietary standards. We've had open standards that have minimal intellectual property rights embedded in them, that have allowed the permissionless innovation that was talked about earlier, about anyone around the world being able to connect in and do business in the global economy. There are threats to that right now. There also is tampering with the core infrastructure of systems of internet governance, like systems of routing and like the domain name system. And it's very important to have the same kind of universality that we've had before. We also have censorship that's happening. We have fragmentation. We've got China hiring 20,000 people, they've just said, to come up with a Chinese Wikipedia. So we're having different kinds of systems, different bodies of knowledge. We have data localization that, as McKinsey said, is costing the financial services industry a lot of money. The point is not that we should move away from the goal of universality. The point is that there should be specific examples of where fragmentation may be more desirable for public interest goals. So that's the choice of having fragmentation to achieve a specific goal, rather than having that choice taken away by these other kinds of things that mitigate against universality.
Just to very quickly build off of that, I should be very careful. I was not advocating for fragmentation. I fought it vociferously. That's in fact how I met Jay when I was researching the rise of Anonymous and hacktivism. Anonymous was planning to attack the Wicked ITU UN discussions and debates. The point I fear is that if we are cavalier and afraid to regulate minimum hygiene for safety critical systems, that catastrophic failure will play directly into the justification of unhealthy, oppressive fragmentation. The easiest fix for Mirai is one country, one vote, nation, state owned, operated chunks of the internet. That is the easiest fix. It's also the least desirable fix. So I'm trying to paint a picture that if we're not aggressive, forward-leaning, and intelligent about how we design resilience in the face of hyperconnectivity, we will play right into the hands of ideas and value systems we don't want to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to agree with both my colleagues. You heard me say it's managing fragmentation. It's being planful about where there are acceptable and potentially even positive fragmentation versus where there is unacceptable fragmentation. Two places that I think about this, or at least two axes to think about. One is looking at the OSI layers. You know, fragmentation in the transport layer is going to be really bad for everybody, right? And then when you start to move up and you get to fragmentation of security requirements relative to applications, for example, high-risk life safety systems looks different than Mattel Barbie. That's a place where fragmentation of security requirements could actually be a very, not just could, in my opinion, is a very useful conversation. But I think that being planful and intentional, not just based on risk, but also recognizing where is the tipping point and that it is going to differ by company and is going to differ in different parts of the region. I'll give an example here, which is, let's imagine that you end up not at the transport layer in internet governance, but in the application layer, thinking about fragmentation of security requirements. And that it's not just life safety systems, it's Barbie Mattel all the way up to the health safety systems. Large companies, global companies, are going to be able to snap to what those requirements are. We're going to complain, we're not going to be happy, we're going to try and challenge it, but ultimately we have the resources to do it. That said, small innovators who are working to actually develop minimal viable products, if there's an over-onerous system that is over-regulated, then that will diminish the innovation marketplace. And so again, that point is being very planful and thoughtful about how to manage that fragmentation such that we realize the economic benefits that are so strong, but that we're also managing the security concerns that could ultimately diminish trust in the ecosystem.
Okay. The word trust and fragmentation is very interesting. We heard Eric Schmidt say earlier today about every country has its own particular legal requirements and so on. And the question that I wonder about, generally speaking, how does an outsider know what some software is going to do? But can we achieve compliance with necessary legal regulations without physical location of computers in every jurisdiction? Not to pick on Microsoft, but Microsoft is currently involved in a disagreement with the United States government about jurisdiction over email in a data center in Dublin. Without opining on the merits of that, it's a very complicated question, and Google's in an even more complicated situation once lawyers figure out what's going on with that. Suppose that there was some international agreement on who should have jurisdiction. Do you have to put a data center in every country, or is there some way to know, and with high assurance, that the data center in Dublin will comply with US law when that is appropriate according to international agreements? Can we really tell what's going on?
Couple of different parts of that question, so I want to make sure I take it apart. So how does an outsider know or have some level of confidence in the kind of behaviors? Is it possible without computers in every location? And what was the last one?
I think I think that how do you really know that a computer the software is actually going to comply with requests that's been implemented correctly, not subverted, and will really do what's legally required. And that's the more general case of how do you know what any software is going to do, but
So this is a place where I think it's important to separate out the, the policy ecosystem from what the technology can do. Technology can be engineered to do basically anything. Now, how technology and software providers and hardware providers, since we're talking about IoT as well, how they demonstrate what that software does is a different thing. But the technology itself can do it.
That's the question I'm getting, the assurance that it's actually doing, what you say it is doing.
Well, and I think it gets to what's relevant for different assurance scenarios, right? Again, I go into the risk environment. There are things that can be done demonstrating self-attestation, so organizations saying, this is what I do. There are organizations like Microsoft and Huawei, for example, who have transparency centers where you allow and invite qualified governments to come in and look at code and run tools against code, because that actually helps improve their trust of what the technology is doing. Those are the technical solutions, but when you start to get into where computers are located and where data is located, that's in the architectural side, right? Not in the bits and bytes, but fundamentally in where those bits and bytes are located and how they behave. So in that context, I think, a couple of things. One, it does matter where certain things are located, but a data center is not going to be built in every single place around the world. That's why some companies are allowing organizations to choose where their data is located, because they can choose the jurisdiction that they either have the trust in the legal mechanisms of, have a relationship in a positive way with a particular government. But these are the kind of things that it is important to know where the physical parts are, but at least from our perspective, it's the data itself that is important, and making sure that we're complying with the legal mechanisms. There is conflict there that governments are going to have to resolve, and that's what you see coming up in the Irish case, which is Microsoft is not saying that's invalid for the U.S. government to get. We're saying, don't come to us to get it, go to the Irish government to get it, and Ireland agrees.
Yes. And so does the Second Circuit.
Yes, thankfully.
So if I truncate the where the email's stored, part of that question, one of the heavy focuses last year, there were 9 first-of-a-kind policies on IoT security and safety last year in the U.S. alone, and we're also working with the NISA and UK government. Many of them had in common the idea of an ingredients list or nutrition label. If you pick up one of your cans of soda near you on the table, it's not going to give you the secret recipe and the intellectual property, but it's going to tell you certain nutritional facts. You can ignore them. It doesn't prevent you from making junk food. It just lets you know, in fact, you're drinking junk food or eating junk food. So a common thread is a transparency regime at least enables free market choice for certain things. So there tends to be some combination of a software bill of materials, which is essentially an ingredients list, transparency about any known vulnerabilities you're passing on. So a failure, what we have right now is a failure to warn of risks you're passing on to the public and your customers. It's usually a kicker of they want to see that the device is patchable. And now after Mirai, there's another one entering the scene that says you shouldn't use fixed credentials. Yeah. So we don't want to make a list of 300,000 things one must do, but the belief is part of that is an attestation through a labeling mechanism that's somewhat standard and digestible. And that way, if you are fraudulently making those claims, there's other mechanisms that could enforce those, and you could also be shunned by the market. But as opposed to holding people responsible for all possible harm, we believe large chunks of the trust can be deserved, maintained, and punished if lied to through some sort of labeling mechanism. You may see audit regimes, though, for the safety critical stuff. In fact, I've seen a pyramid where you have 3 levels of ways to handle this. The IoT at the top are the safety critical ones that have an existing regulator, like the Food and Drug Administration, like cars, and those are already adapting. There were several of them last year. The middle tier are devices that are manageable, like in an enterprise, but they're not quite manageable yet, and we're trying to use standards like the IETF to create ways to make this more programmatically manageable for the middle. The really hard one that could trigger this crisis of confidence is the long tail of the devices at the bottom that are unmanaged and unmanageable. And if they don't receive some level of minimum standard of hygiene, that's where the unsolved problem is. We have a good solution here. We're talking about possible things here. The bottom layer of unmanaged and unmanageable devices is where you're going to have some sort of minimum kitchen safety code or minimum, flight inspection or those kind of things.
Can I?
Yeah.
Do we have the time to?
We just barely have the time, but go on.
Okay, so I'll try to be very quick, even though I'm Italian. Just to adapt to what my colleague said on your last question, and I really don't mean to be polemic, and I should say I've been working in the IT sector throughout my professional life. It's a sector that I deeply love. I think it has incredible potential for the benefits of all of us, as citizens. I am fundamentally an optimist about importance and the value of information and communication technologies for us as human beings. But having said that, I also know the sector enough that I know that sometimes we tend collectively to be extremely self-centered, to not look at all at what other sectors in human life have been doing and how they have been handling very similar problems. The kind of questions that I heard from you, Steve, and that I hear, and they're very good questions, but we should not forget that the whole issue of, massively cross-border human behavior, it's not peculiar, it's not typical to the IT sector. We see that in the financial sector, we see that again in the global agri-food business, we see that to an increasing extent in the manufacturing sector, and somehow we have managed, not perfectly, I mean there are problems, we managed to create a situation in which we do not have to deal with catastrophic crises every other day. One might argue, for example, that the financial sector had reached a level of complexity, which was too high, which was one, according to some, of the reasons why we had the 2008 financial crisis, because basically regulators or even the instrument itself didn't even understand anymore what it is that it was doing, didn't understand the financial instruments that it was, and it didn't understand the complexity and the vulnerabilities that it was introducing into the system. And maybe in the IT sector we might be in a similar situation, but the bottom line is that we should not forget that we have solved this kind of situation. We should not see, in my opinion at least, I respectfully maintain that we should not see the IT sector as so peculiar that any other solution that we have found for other sectors should not or could not apply to this particular changing what needs to be changed, could not be applied to this sector. And last point on this, the whole question of the whole debate on data localization and or data flows, the two interrelated debates, I would say this, at the end of the day, I don't think that people, including Europe, where, by the way, we do not have, certainly not at the European level, and I would argue not even at the national level, we do not have regulation on horizontal data localization. That is something to keep in mind, because sometimes you hear that it's just not factually not true. But in any case, I don't believe that anybody in Europe really cares, ultimately, beyond the political posturing, beyond the press releases, cares where the data is located. What we care about, what people care about is who is responsible if that data is misused. Which laws are going to be applied if that data is misused. I don't care that my data is in the US or in China, well, maybe in China yes, but in the US or in any country that approximately I know has a similar way of looking at governance than the European Union, as long as I know that my rights as a European citizen are respected. It's not the location of the data, it's what happens when something goes wrong, and I go back to my original argument. It's that governance, it's that institutional infrastructure that we need to make sure is strong enough so that people don't lose trust when something goes wrong, and as we know, things will go wrong sooner or later.
Always do.
Yeah, we're definitely in a data-centric world. What happens to the data is certainly more important than where it is if we can get the legal and technical mechanisms in place. Well, we have a few questions from the audience. We have a bit of time. Just want to use the microphone there so everyone can hear.
That's good.
Hi, Sean Canuck with Stanford University. I have a question for Joshua in the specific, but for the panel in principle. An economist will tell you that you don't want to live in a society with absolute zero crime or risk because the inefficiency they would take would just slow down every transaction. I'll also offer the example of banks who dealt with check fraud for many years, internalized the costs, passed them on the customer, and they accepted a certain level of distrust because it was able to be absorbed by the system. So, to Josh specifically, your national highway guy, was he pretending he was going to get zero highway deaths? Or how many was he ready to accept? Or in healthcare, how many anomalous deaths are we ready to accept in hospitals? And to the group at large, especially the technology creators and providers, what level of distrust do you think can actually be viable within the system and absorbed such that you have public confidence even with an acceptance that there's a certain percentage of distrust? Thank you.
All right, excellent points. We know there will be deaths. We anticipate deaths. I think we're most fragile right now because we are least prepared for these scenarios. So our advocacy here is not that we will avoid a high fatality death in the hospital environment due to cyber incident. It's that we want to have plans, left of boom and right of boom, right? We want to have the preparedness, the disaster recovery. What are we going to say to the American people? How quickly could we respond? So it's not about avoiding these, it's more of a resilience preparedness model. That said, when you're talking about economics, when we've started to engage economists, we're working on a project to say at what point and by which criteria would liability make sense. And we're using economists, lawyer, insurer, innovators, and cyber folks in a cross-functional rubric. Right now, at least at a blush, the economists say we are doing something highly diseconomic because we have placed the risk burden on the victims. And they said two things: markets want to be efficient, and markets hate being personified. Think about that for a second. But what we really want to get to is what are the common sense 80-20 rules, not the whole TSA apparatus and compromise of personal protections and privacies, but the steel reinforced cockpit door. Like, what are the small adjustments we can make for maximum gain? Of course, you need to get to a point of diminishing returns and marginal costs and marginal gains arguments. That's why we're including a lot of economic principles from the get-go for this. But we shouldn't assume that because you're always going to have a residual level of crime or risk or harm, that we've hit that optimum. We should be able to come up with the instruments that can determine that optimum. And we're far from it right now.
Did you want to add? Go ahead first.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think the original design mistake, or the greatest design mistake in the internet, is the trust between people. Everyone will upgrade to IPv6 for the good of the network. No one will exploit that known, when I was a lowly graduate student at Cornell, no one will exploit that known protocol vulnerability, and then we had the Morris worm that decimated the internet at the time. John Podesta thought the email was from someone, he trusted the person. I use that as a lead-in to something that one of the inventors of public key cryptography said to me. He said, back in the 70s, we never imagined that all of these things would not be encrypted. And I say that because I'm challenging the presumption of the question a little bit, because in some cases the economists are wrong, and that you can have very strong public key cryptography, or you can have very, very strong end-to-end encryption to mitigate against some of these problems. And it's a matter of designing distrust into the system.
Oh, interesting.
Nice. What level of distrust is acceptable? It would be awesome if we could put a whiteboard up here and draw a line of what is acceptable or unacceptable distrust. But I think unfortunately we can't. What I can do is give examples of what we've seen in the ecosystem and maybe talk about where we're at right now. So in the early and mid 90s, when you think about it was a Windows only, Windows primarily 98% ecosystem, and you had Slammer and Blaster and all these really, really very embarrassing and painful things. I was an end user at the time, not working for Microsoft. We started to get complaints from our financial services customers, and they were going to be moving out of the Windows ecosystem and starting to build their own ecosystem of technology because they could not trust the technology to perform their business functions. That level of distrust was unacceptable to us. And that drove a security innovation and wave, software development that not only is Microsoft using, but in terms of what is good to do for software assurance, there are things that are pretty well known. How they are applied is not as well known. Two, another example, which is an acceptable or unacceptable level of distrust. Post-Snowden, we had customers who were concerned about their location of data because they were concerned about jurisdictional access to it. Interestingly enough, that came primarily from enterprise customers, while law enforcement is normally looking for the consumer side data. But whatever, it doesn't matter. It was a distrust, it was a feeling. And so you started to have the percolation of movement away from global hyperscale platforms into local platforms. Again, for us, that level of distrust was unacceptable, and that's when we started evolving our operating models to deal with that. However, if you were one of the local cloud providers, that level of distrust was not only acceptable to you, that was desirable because it was helping your business. So where that distrust is different. When I move out and I look at where things are at right now, if I think about it as like a tipping point, the amount of information that has come out on attacks, threats, I hate using the word attacks, but basically threats and attacks that's in the public domain has not yet discouraged use. But I do think that we are starting to see the emergence of a place of a tipping point. And that's why the conversations like the one on this panel is incredibly important, because you don't want to get past the tipping point without realizing it and know where that acceptable or unacceptable place is. We cannot move to a place where there's absolute trust. That will not work for the innovation economy. However, there is a place where you start to actually get diminishing return on investment, or you start to reach the existential challenges. And I think that particularly the concerns about life safety systems and the effect, the aggregate effect on the global economy of nation-state acts could be a place where that tipping point is reached if we're not careful.
Okay, I think it's time for one more question, and time for the break here.
That's a little longer than I meant it to be. Very good. I wish I had seen it.
Just quickly, most of the conversation today about trust has been trust up. And I want to flip it and just ask you guys how you think fragmentation is impacting trust down. So your ability as platform providers, as software developers to trust the user. Just two quick examples, because I haven't heard a lot about it and I'm a little bit surprised. Microsoft pulling more and more enterprise and sort of client-side applications into their own platform space. And then Google attempting to centralize more of the Android code base into an area that they can control and update more frequently. What's the process by which you build trust with the user in trying to understand this new equilibrium where you expect them to have some, hopefully, agency in this security relationship? And realistically, where do you think that threshold sits? Because what it sounds like from listening to everyone is that at the moment, no one's happy with the status quo.
Criminals are pretty happy.
Someone else should go first.
Let's try and make the answers quick, because we are over time now, so.
I don't think this is necessarily the deliberate choice, but the shift to more cloud-hosted software monoliths, in part, is because of the cost and support headaches of such untrustworthy customers and hygiene issues. So it went from an intractable problem to a more tractable problem. I don't think they would articulate that was for a security choice, but I know it had security benefit. And for some reason you triggered a Dan Gearism. Remember the end-to-end principle of I'm okay, you're okay, the middle might get interesting? He likes to say now, I assume I'm compromised, I have to assume you're hosed, and the middle make it worse, right? So I think getting to more tractable, less complex, greater spheres of control and complexity reduction are possibly an implicit response to some of what you're getting at, but I want to think about it more.
I'll be very brief here and say the accountability and responsibility for implementing security as you move to this more cloud-based infrastructure is a very difficult problem. Non-trivially, because a lot of, this is going to sound terrible, but a lot of salespeople are like, don't worry, move to the cloud, you're all safe then. But the challenge is that that's not true. There are actually responsibilities for the end user relevant to how they connect to the cloud. The classic example, and Trey, you've heard me say this, is identity. The credential harvesting is a huge problem in the on-premise environment. It is also a huge problem in the cloud environment because if credentials aren't maintained, it looks like a valid login to the cloud environment. And so there's a part there where we're having to have a really interesting conversation about the resegmentation of responsibilities for security, and unfortunately it's not static. It's not things that it's always going to be this or always going to be that, depends on the model. That said, I think that we do have mechanisms in place where things connecting to the cloud, how do you trust the user? You are able to do different checks and balances on when someone connects to that environment to provide some of the security benefits at scale. And that was a little bit of a short answer, hopefully.
Okay, so we're out of time, and I'll leave one thought as everyone files off the stage. We've got all this trust and fragmentation. How do we come up with an intuitive notion of this? The extent of territorial waters was defined several hundred years ago as the range of shore-based cannon. You could visualize that. How do we do that on the net? Thank you.
So let's